Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Rob and I are back at it. We've been ships passing each other in the night the last couple of weeks, but we're back, and we'll be back next week too. So double weeks with Rob. A really good exploratory conversation on artificial intelligence, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and all sorts of other things. Write to me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com if you have any question, comments, or concerns, or if you have an answer to the question that I posed at the end of the podcast. Ha! That means you have to listen to the end. And if you do that, maybe you'll also leave a rating or review on the podcast. Takes just a few seconds of your time, but is immensely helpful for us. Okay, take care of the people you love. Cheers, and see you out there. All right, listeners, we're back at it. We've got only 50 minutes today because I unfortunately have a hard stop. Rob, it's been a couple weeks since we got together. We had our company meeting. You and I are both busy, and it's the summertime as a parent, which I used to get excited for summer, and now it's like I'm still excited for summer. It's like nice quality time with the kids, but I'm also ready for the school year to get started again. So I'm experiencing that feeling. But anyway, there's a lot of stuff for us to dive into. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about was the bombshell news from last week. And I think the bombshell news is not what the Bureau of Labor Statistics said about employment in the United States, although I'm curious what your take is from a macro level about that. Non-farm payrolls rose by 73,000. The unemployment rate is at 4.2%. Number of unemployed, 7.2 million. If you look at a chart, it's remarkable how stable that's really been since the pandemic. I mean, there have been little moves here and there, but we're basically hovering around those same numbers since the pandemic. The unemployment range has been 4% to 4.2% since May 2024, to give you a sense of it. But there were some pretty big revisions to the May and June data. They were larger than normal revisions. May was revised down by 125,000 jobs, and June was revised down by 133,000 jobs. And this led some to report that this is, the worst jobs reports or the worst 3-month trend that we've seen since COVID. Another sort of really disturbing thing is once you start stripping out healthcare and social assistance jobs, the U.S. has actually hemorrhaging workers in the workforce. So aside from healthcare and social assistance, maybe some small additions in financial activities and leisure and hospitality, but they're all the meat and potatoes part of the economy not doing so well when you're looking at U.S. job growth over the past 8 to 12 months. But that's not even the big news. The big news is that President Trump did not like the report and decided to fire the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and claimed her of rigging the jobs report and saying that they weren't accurate. This, by the way, is someone who was appointed by an 86-8 margin in the Senate in January 2024. Vice President Vance was a senator then and gave the thumbs up for her. So this is not some like crazy lefty Biden hangover liberal. Like this is somebody who even Trump's pick for commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics in his first term came out and said, she's great. I don't know why they're going after her. She's like, in the best way possible, really boring. She's just really good at her job and gathering statistics. I also, I got this from Ben Hunt and a couple other people, and I think we've talked about it a little bit before, but there are inputs for CPI numbers, so not employment, but CPI numbers, which for months are being modeled rather than collected directly because of some of the cuts brought on by the Department of Government Efficiency. Like BLS has been struggling to even get real data for some of the projections that it puts out in general. So I'll just leave it there for you to take where you want, Rob. I put out a little thing on Substack talking about how I feel like I'm in a twilight zone where I have to use the same analytical approach to US data now as I have to use with Chinese data. And I think this also backs into a conversation about the quality of data, about how artificial intelligence is producing a lot of content and it's going to be pulling from data that is increasingly shitty and increasingly politicized, and that is going to create even more noise. So there's lots of directions we could go. What was your first reaction?
Well, boy, there are a lot of directions we can go with this. I think where I'd like to start is just to put this into context with the macro, which is that the economy has been slowing. So this is not surprising data. The employment numbers were actually one of the outliers in terms of not showing the same sort of weakness that you were starting to see in other numbers. So
Mm-hmm.
the adjustments make sense, and we don't have to talk about macro, but just to throw that out there, that this was sort of one of the last shoes to drop in terms of the data coming in, and employment is fairly backward looking. So it does lag the cycle, but this is normal, is the key thing there.
Why
Um,
why why does employment lag the cycle, if you don't mind me asking?
well, because companies don't really slow employment or conduct layoffs until things have already started to slow, because there's a certain friction. And in fact, one of the most interesting macro dilemmas that are on my whiteboard here of things that we're researching and looking at is, are we starting to see signs of labor hoarding?
Hmm.
In the post-COVID environment, where it was very difficult to get labor, that could be happening. I don't know. I think we can't know until we really see corporate profitability begin to weaken, because right now companies have a lot of extra cushion to carry larger workforces than usual. What we saw throughout really the last 20 years was companies were always very quick to to conduct layoffs in order to protect their margins, because they would assume like it was a buyer's market for labor.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's changing. My suspicion is that that's changing, and that we're going to see a very different dynamic, which is a very bad outcome for corporate profits over the course of a whole cycle. But it's too early to say. But I just want to put a pin in that and say, well, we'll probably end up talking about that in a future episode, because
Hmm.
it's very interesting macro change that would change a lot of things if it is indeed playing out.
Yeah, and I guess you would have to balance that with the tax cuts becoming permanent, or do you think corporate profitability was just assuming that the tax cuts were going to be continued
Well,
indefinitely?
corporates always think about their profitability in terms of operating profit, because that's what investors look at. When investors like us are analyzing them and on the calls asking them questions and grilling them, it's always your EBIT margins, your operating margins. It's never below the line items, because that gets really messy. So the tax cuts, yeah, I mean, they're good because they increase net profit and they increase your cash flow. But in terms of what a CEO is thinking about when they're like, oh, should I make these layoffs or not? It's always about that operating profit line, and that's usually how they're paid. It's based on EBIT, not based on net profit. Um, so that's just one thing to talk about. The second thing is just how hard it is to do the BLS's job. I think this is often overlooked, and people criticize, including obviously Trump came out and criticized, oh, these revisions. And the thing is, the revisions are always huge. And just to put a little context here, because I think it's useful, and not a lot of people really get this, but they're trying to estimate how many Americans out of a population of 350 million people have jobs, which is hard enough as it is. But then they're trying to divide that by how many people are actually looking for jobs. And that's how you get the unemployment number. The second number is extremely difficult. And one of the key moving factors right now is immigration, because we had a surge of immigration post COVID and now obviously moving in the opposite direction. The employment numbers are always notoriously bad whenever there's big changes in that denominator. So there's really two ways that they try to measure it. The first way is they go directly to employers and they say, well, how many people are working for you? And they take a statistical sample and they try to extrapolate that to the overall population. And that's the number that everyone cites. That's the in, employment payrolls, the headline number. But then they have another number called, which is the household number, which essentially, whereas I think in the employer one, they survey like 400,000 businesses, and it's easy to survey businesses because they're organizations; they'll respond on a regular basis. But then they have something where they go to like 45,000 households, and they say, well, how many people are working? Um, and oftentimes, like the discrepancies you get between those two things are shockingly huge. Like if you were looking at this data, you would say, oh my God, this is absolutely worthless. Um, and you would think, oh, it's because people have multiple jobs, but it's really not that. It's because the denominator is just so hard to measure, because people are coming in and out of the workforce, the population is fluctuating. For example, when employment is running really hot, um, in prior cycles, you always statistically undercounted the number of Black Americans who are working, because Black Americans tend to be, more mobile in and out of the labor force depending on conditions, and for that reason, it's just a real difficult dilemma to try to measure. What is the actual employment rate? What is the total number of jobs in the economy? For all these reasons. So the point is, it's a nightmare of a statistical dilemma. I think that's the key takeaway on that part. Which brings me to sort of the political angle of this, which is, the BLS is a really boring place. It's not a political institution. It's not an institution that sets policy. It's an extremely process-driven, nerdy, statistic, you know, oriented place where you have these processes that are very much in place, that are very well set in stone. They're not taking chances. They're not doing weird things. They have a difficult enough job as it is, that you have these people who are extremely process oriented and sort of implementing these processes. And they don't change the methodology. They don't experiment. So this is one of the least politicized places in the American system, but it also makes it one of the hardest to change just from top down fiat. Like, he can get rid of, like we talked about the Fed and how, it's one thing to get rid of the Fed chair, but in reality, it's very difficult to actually influence policy by just appointing people, because you have to justify your policy. And in the 1970s, in our last conversation, we talked about how Arthur Burns was sort of in the pocket of the government, but because he had good reasons to think, that having a dovish policy was the right thing to do. The BLS is like that, but even more so. Like, you can't have a political appointee come in and say, well, we're going to change the statistical methodology, because you're in a room full of statisticians. And, most of these people are not appointed. These are, highly skilled, highly trained bureaucrats. So, in short, I don't think it's going to change that much. I think it's like the Fed conversation, but much more so, where he's going to say what he says, and he can fire the political appointees, but the machine rumbles on underneath.
Yeah, I mean that's a good place to end, because I did the same thing that we did with the Fed. I was looking back in time and trying to figure out, well, just how strange is this? And actually, Andrew Ross Sorkin posted on X. He beat me to this, but he tweeted about the story about Ethelbert Stewart. Ever heard of Ethelbert Stewart, Rob?
I have
He was
not.
the commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics from 1921 to 1932. Really interesting time to be the commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics when you think about the Great Depression, post World War I, the booming 20s, everything else, and basically like is the father of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. He has an incredible biography, by the way. He started as a coffin maker, then he founded and edited labor newspapers, then he was commissioner of labor for the state of Illinois, then eventually backs his way into government and doing things there. And he runs afoul of Herbert Hoover in 1930. Herbert Hoover did not like the employment data that Stewart was reporting, and Hoover was also apparently trying to get this bureau underneath the census survey, and Stewart insisted, no, it needs to be independent. We don't want to politicize this data. And he was not fired, but he was forcibly retired. Yet another Blade Runner is just everywhere right now, Rob. So Ethelbert Stewart is retired by Herbert Hoover in 1932. I found a couple other examples, like in the early 1960s, there were accusations that the Kennedy White House was actually reporting things the wrong direction, that they were actually trying to magnify the unemployment problem as a pretext for supporting more government spending and more regulation, and that they were juicing the figures that way. Of course, our favorite Richard Nixon, he actually in 1971 shut down Bureau of Labor Statistics press briefings after the agency reported a 0.2% drop in unemployment and said it was only marginally significant. Apparently, Nixon wanted them to be a little bit more positive about it in general. So it's not the first time that you've had some of this friction between the two. Also, to your point, and I'll actually post this link in the podcast survey, BLS has a great article on its own website. Hopefully it doesn't get deleted in the next couple of months. They published it in January 2018. And they talk about how they've been tracking unemployment for the past 75 years. And to your point, talking about how difficult it is to do some of these things and how really they didn't start having good models for unemployment until the late 1930s. So even while Stewart and Hoover are yelling at each other, like they don't even really have the models in place to do the beginnings of the type of their reporting that they're doing till then. And also sort of to what you said, something that uh, I stole this quote from, I think, statistician George Box is his name, but all models are wrong, but some are useful. The jobs number, even when they're reporting it, they're only getting to like 60% of what they'd like to have in addition. That's one of the reasons they update after the fact, because they're still collecting information. But because we think we are entitled to data on the first of every month, we demand that we have the data, even though things haven't actually been collected yet. And so the BLS model, it's supposed to update, and it's really not supposed to give you an exact number. It's supposed to give you a sense of directionality, and it's supposed to give both the government and businesses one data indicator to help them with the directionality of the economy. And that to me is the deeper thing here, because even in the case of Ethelbert Stewart, we can say, okay, yes, a president fired a commissioner before. Okay, but like the BLS wasn't even the BLS then. Like that was a conversation about how to collect data in the first place. Like the United States was a much different place then. Yes, you had Nixon, Kennedy, and others who were trying to, position the data differently on a PR level, but they weren't taking a chainsaw to government bureaucracy at the beginnings of their terms. They weren't going out and publicly lambasting bureaucrats and saying these people are frauds and they are trying to help the other side, and I'm firing them immediately, and I'm only putting people who are in place who do the things that I want to do. And I think there is a qualitative difference there, different from any of the others. And I think it's also a little bit different. Well, maybe not a little bit different from the Fed, because the other thing that it does is if you're a statistician, if you're one of these people who wanted to go work at the BLS, you don't want to work there anymore. Why would you want to go to this place if it's going to be politicized? To your point, I imagine that the people that are working there, like Ethelbert Stewart, are even nerdier than you and I am, which is really saying something. They just want to play with statistics. And if you tell them, no, you actually need to create a picture of America's new golden age, like, why should they do that? There are probably tons more applications for their talents in other places, analyzing the copious amounts of data that we have in the world rather than being told what the data is supposed to suggest. So I do think when you're thinking about whether it's the Fed, whether it's the BLS, whether it's health and technology and research, like I do think there is material damage being done to the United States in that sense. And that's why I would stick on, even though I just gave you all the examples of how this happens before in US politics, that this one feels qualitatively different to me. This one I'm not willing to sort of wave aside in the same way that I am with the Fed one. Do you take issue with that, or would you say, like Jacob, like calm down a little bit?
I think it's really hard to know because we don't know the context politically. Like we can read the history books, but to really feel and be in the moment in those historical situations to know what that was like, I think is what you would need to really make that comparison. So I don't know. Like my instinct is that this is worrisome, but it's not as, oh my God, hair on fire worrisome as, commentators would like to think. That said, if it continues and it's one thing to remove the Fed chair and to say things and to put pressure on them. It's another thing if and this is a process, it will have to be a process. If they really come in and they push for this, if he just loses interest and goes on to the next media cycle thing, I think, yes, it'll just be, an extreme version of what we've seen in the past. But if they deliberately make a push to put people in there, to push the party line, to truly change the methodology of what they're doing, to have oversight or editorial control over what's published, that would be a big difference, and that would be a sign of true, you know, changing of the guard, which I think is very possible. Like we've been talking about, you know, volatility spiral and sort of some of these bigger issues, and have been mostly right about things going to places that people didn't expect even a few years ago. So I think it's well within the realm of possibility. That's not what we're seeing now.
Yeah, and I've brought up this Tony Judd quote before, where he did a lecture in the late 20 aughts, where he talked about how the real threat to America is not the will to power of an ambitious individual, but the will to ignorance of society. So I think to your point, I doubt that President Trump is going to roll up his sleeves and get somebody in there who's going to play with the models. Like even if Marco Rubio adds commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics to his job description, all the different things that he's doing, like he doesn't know anything about statistics. He's probably just going to keep the thing going, and they're going to put lipstick on the pig and do different things around PR. To minimize, but this goes back to the thing about not the job numbers, but CPI. And again, something I got from Ben Hunt on X, but he talked about how 1/3 of inputs used to calculate the CPI are no longer measured because of staff shortages in the BLS, and that those numbers are now modeled via historical correlation to other inputs. Now, you're probably not going to see much inaccuracy because we're pretty close to those historical models, right? You can probably extrapolate pretty well. But if we're 2 years from now and you're still dealing with staff shortages, and let's say, one half of the inputs are being modeled based on historical correlation to other inputs, and every once in a while, Trump pops up his head when he gets a report that he doesn't like and he rails about it on social media. Do we get to a place not where President Trump is the puppeteer pulling the strings and, George Orwellian, the data is good, even though the data is bad, but rather just the data being sloppy, not actually having any sense of directionality or correlation to reality in any sense, because the data itself is not good and nobody is worried about fixing it. Instead, they're worried about how to massage it and position it and make it part of a narrative. That will to ignorance Tony Jutt line is in my mind, because that's where we go. And it leads into some of the AI conversation, because if that hypothesis is true, if the sources of shared data that everybody is using, whether it's investors or economists or the BLS or this is a public resource. Like it's something that we all use. You don't have to pay for. There is no copyright on government data. That's when I publish pieces, I'm always looking for government graphs, because I know I can put it in a report and I have no copyright infringement, because literally the American people own it. Anybody can go take it. If that data starts to decline in quality, then all of these different highfalutin AI things and scraping data and putting data together, like it feels like there's something wrong at the core of it. I rambled a little bit, but do you have that sort of fear inside of you?
No, I think that instinct is definitely right. I mean, you have to look at the incentives. I mean, I have the Bloomberg terminal open in front of me right now, and I can see, day-to-day spending data on, alt data that's collected from credit card scans and things like that, which is very expensive. And, if you don't have a $25,000 Bloomberg terminal, you can't see that. And you have to depend on the government data. And that's a worrying trend, because, they're pissing in the public pool. And increasingly, like, I think that's right. Like those who have the incentive to create private mirrors and better versions of this are going to do it. Which isn't to like lionize the quality of public data. Like just take the CPI, for instance. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of the inputs are no longer being measured. But if you actually look at the CPI report, there's like 400 things on there. It's like leather shoe buckles and like every sort of weird, obscure little thing you could ever spend your money on is in that CPI report. And the irony is, like, at the end of the day, like three things matter. It's housing, health, health costs, and you know, that's basically it.
Energy or something. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
even
mean,
energy isn't that big of a deal. And even within housing, um, it's so dumb because it depends so much on how you measure that. So we use OER, owner's equivalent rent, which basically tries to take house prices and make an adjustment of that. So if you were to go and buy your house again at current market rate, what would that cost you? So whenever house prices go up, which they've been going up, but there's not many transactions, it makes housing inflation look bad. But the reality is you're not buying a new house. Your housing costs haven't changed because you're locked in. And so are 98% of Americans, or whatever it is. If you go to Canada, which is, in case you don't know, right next door, their CPI numbers look totally different because they use a different methodology. They use the
mhm.
replacement cost. So they look at building materials costs and they use that to estimate. So the point is, like, the numbers are completely different just because the methodology is completely different. And CPI data is really, really hard. It's really hard to collect. It's really hard to figure out how you actually measure this. There's been a site called Shadow Stats that's been around for like 25 years, and the whole thing is, oh, they're not measuring the CPI data right because they're pulling the wool over your eyes, Americans, and they have this whole alternative way that they calculate it. So none of this is new, and we shouldn't you know overestimate how great the data is even under normal conditions. But yeah, this definitely is not going to help, and it makes everyone's job harder, especially like the Fed, because the Fed can't be like, well, I looked at the Bloomberg alt data. Like, they have to root what they do and their decisions in public data and sort of things that are viewed traditionally as mainstream and credible, and that's tricky if the quality continues to get bad.
Yeah, I take your point about the CPI. Although I think one of the concerning things about the CPI is it's not just that they're like no longer collecting the actual prices of underwater belt loops or something like that. It's actually like geographically tied. So in different towns that are far away or maybe declining, where population is leaving and things like that, you're getting geographic holes. So even in that small town, which doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things, but maybe you have small towns that are no longer, that data is no longer being collected. And so it's less that you're missing some small input, but that maybe geographically, if you're looking on a more local or regional basis, maybe you're not getting the full picture. So if you're a company and you're thinking about expanding into a region in the United States or trying to make long-term decisions about what prices look like in that particular region, like that's the sort of data that I actually do think is valuable, and that I would be concerned about if we keep on with these staff shortages, if they keep on not collecting the data. Like that's one area where to think about it. The other thing, this reminds me of something I was catching up with. He's a meteorologist. He's pretty famous in the ag world. Eric Snodgrass. We spoke at the same event a couple of months ago, and I was asking him about the cuts to NOAA in the United States as a result of Doge. And you might have seen, by the way, there's apparently emergency authorization for them to hire. They cut something like 500 plus employees from NOAA, and now there's emergency authorization to go back and hire 450. So I mean, gosh, like just the legacy of Doge not aging particularly well. But I talked to him back in March when these things were still fresh, and when Elon Musk was still ascendant. And he said, sort of a version of what you said. He said, like, look, for me, it's not that big of a deal because I subscribe to some other models, like European models, and my company that I work for pays a bunch of money for it, so I can still get access to the data. But if you're just a normal Joe Schmo in the United States and you're trying to figure out precipitation on your farm or potential risk of hurricanes or some new storm forming, you can't pay however much money it is to get access to the fancy model that I overhear that still is getting you the data. And that sort of gets to what you said about the Bloomberg terminal, like you're paying however much for a Bloomberg terminal. I feel like since the internet, information has been increasingly more commoditized, and the price of information has been going down and down and down. It's subscription models under pressure, and like there are a few things that can still charge, but like generally speaking, like all that information has been democratized. But I want, this is very speculative, but maybe we're moving in the opposite direction. Maybe this is the reverse commoditization of data. Maybe 5 years from now, if things continue on this trajectory, Bloomberg Terminal will charge 4x what it does right now, and you'll have no choice but to pay, because unless you're an Amazon or a Microsoft or somebody who has their tentacles in the U.S. economy with their own data and can source that sort of data themselves rather than depending on the United States, like you're going to have to cough up for the few sources that maybe can gather these things. And maybe the Bloomberg terminal can't. Maybe the Bloomberg like terminal is going to be built on like a house of cards that'll be tougher and tougher to gather from. So it just seems to me that, and maybe we're not going to head in this direction. Like to your point, maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. Maybe the Trumpers who are listening will be like, oh, this guy with the Trump derangement syndrome, he can't go an episode without criticizing something. I'm trying not to do that. I'm just saying, like, if you extrapolate from here, it seems to me like the quality of information that many of us use on a daily basis, don't even know that we use on a daily basis, seems to be going down. And that seems to me problematic, and also seems to put a higher value on information than we've even considered information having in 30, 40 years. Like, I doubt that Gen Z like even like can think of an era when they had to charge or when they had to pay for information the way that you and I did, even when we were like in college. So
Yeah, just to go back to the Tony Jute quote, I think part of this is it reveals a lack of respect for information and objective data and statistics as a method to determine policy or politics. Like, that's gone out the window, and that seems like a pretty big part of it too. Is like, politically, I'm not sure that anyone cares about the CPI. Like, yes, it's a number that gets posted, or the jobs numbers. Like, is anyone actually looking at this stuff? And partly it's why I think Trump won't go through all the trouble to expend, his power to try to truly change these institutions, because I don't know if anyone who supports him cares, or Americans on average care that much. Whereas, just culturally, it's very, very different, and maybe that's biased because I'm here. Because especially the French, they love their statistics, and like if you go, I was in the train station this past week, and they have all the books that you can buy to read on the train, and all of the politicians have their own book, and it's like, the future of France and my policy, blah blah blah. And it's all so like it harkens back to an older time in American politics, because all the books are like, well, I would adjust this rate, and it's very like there's charts, and you know like I can't imagine an American politician writing a book with charts in it these days. um, which is partially cultural, partially sort of the zeitgeist in the U.S. just being in a different place. But um, yeah, I mean, data and statistics, if you're relying on them as a public good, like you rely on the water system, uh, it's going to depreciate quickly, because it's just not the will to maintain that.
Yeah, and this is a much older conversation, by the way. I mean, folks like David Hume and Max Weber were talking about the fact value distinction long before you and I were ever wandering around here. And it was Nietzsche who fundamentally challenged that distinction, who basically said that facts are always interpreted through the lens of values, and that there are no objective, neutral perspectives. And I think it's not just Americans. I think we struggle with the fact value distinction, have struggled with it since the beginning of modernity, because you can find facts to back up what, quote unquote, facts to back up whatever your worldview is. And what started as oh no, there is a fact and there is a value, and you're able to distinguish between it. It's actually much harder to do that in practice. And France is actually a wonderful example. France was a very, very divided country around the Renaissance and into modernity. Different languages, different systems for measurement, different cultural values, and part of the centralization of the French government, like the act of creating a French nation, in some sense began with the collection of the same statistics in every single region, and saying, okay, everybody is going to use these metrics and these values, and we're going to collect this data on this population, and we're going to teach the same things in schools and the same languages, and you get the emergence of a modern French nation as a result of the act of gathering objective statistics. And that was seen as a sort of positivist way of embracing modernity and change, because your ability to have access to data allowed you to conceptualize something beyond just your local area. But France is also a great example of how imperfect that is. Like, yes, the French have great data. I like French government data. You know what government data France doesn't have? They don't have any official data on what percent of their population is Muslim, because they insist on radical secularism. Everybody is French, so why should we gather this data? Because it is ideologically, odious for us to suggest that, well, you've got Muslims and Jews. No. Everybody is French, and then everybody has their religion inside of their own house. So if you're trying to understand now, for example, the potential impact of a migration problem in France, or what problems France has with assimilating Muslim immigrants in its own countries, you have to guess at that data. The government's not collecting data on how many Muslims are in the country. You have to go to independent sources that are trying to get at that number in all sorts of different ways, and have a French government that is actually optimized to prevent the collection of that data in service of this notion that everyone is French and secularism should be the be all end all of the state, which goes back to the fact value distinction. Like, okay, like sure, the French government is collecting data, but there's a value of secularism that affects what data they're going to collect. And so now, even if it's the most objectively, parsimoniously chosen data in the entire world, and it's absolutely perfect, but they've decided not to collect something because of an ideology. And so is that data factual? Is it value driven? Like, how do you interact with it? So I'm not saying this is only American or that it's anything new. It's like at the core of our society. But I do think you're right that in some sense, the cheapening of information, the ability to just open up Google and say, okay, like let's see, like let's type this answer, means people didn't have to work hard to get information, lost the sort of the value, the work value associated with it. Everything was just available, and AI is making that even worse. You just go into Chat GPT, as I did last night, and say, hey, what what bars do I need to put on top of my car if I want to load something up to go to the beach in a couple of weeks? Like before, I would have had to go do research and do some measurements and maybe talk to the dealer and like, how do I install? No, I just, hey, Chat GPT, like give it to me. So I think there's something, I don't know, I'm circling around a point. There's something there about the cheapening of information. So we've accepted it now as something that's just readily available, and in that sense, we lost both a sense of what information and value is associated with it, and also the notion that information is imperfect. Like I think one of the weird things about this is that people expect that you can just go Google something and find the answer, because that's how accustomed we are to having information at our fingertips. And you can find an answer, you can find something that answers your question, whether it's the right answer. Like most people don't care about that anymore, and maybe never cared about it before. It's just that before you had to work really hard to get the information, and now you can just find information that backs up whatever point of view you have.
In multiple years of podcasting together, I think the observation you just made about the fact value spectrum and France and sort of the underlying reason, like that's one of the most profound things you've ever said, Jacob. So I
Oh,
really liked that.
well,
Just
I
to
can
just
take
to flag that for the listeners, you should bookmark that one as one of Jacob's greatest hits.
Oh, well, nonsense. I can take credit for none of it. Thank you to Professor Suman Seth, who was my professor at Cornell University when I did history of science, and we did a whole section on this. And if that's of interest to listeners, there are entire books that have been written about this. So I'm really just riffing on something that Suman. I don't even know if you're listening, Suman. You should really come on the podcast. Maybe I'll reach out to you. But that's all just taken from him, and you could tell that it really lodged itself in my brain because here I am decades later, and I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah,
So.
but the observation about how it connects with French history, particularly, and the regionalism and the desire, like that's spot on. Um,
Well, great. For our 76 French listeners, and I don't know how many of them are Muslim because we have no statistics, like I hope you enjoy that wonderful take.
the AI thing is a really interesting part of all this, and maybe we can veer into this area for the time that we
Mm-hmm.
have left, because um, it really complicates things, AI, really in two ways. Because first, the form factor in which you receive information is not as a menu of Google facts. Like you just described Google, everyone's experienced it. Google is literally a list of things, and it's incumbent on you to sort of parse through it and figure out what is, and that's changing now that they have the AI
I know.
answer.
Fucking hate it. Anyway.
But AI is there to give you an answer, and that's the UI. And people are already beginning to game that, or to try to game that. So the new SEO is MEO, model optimization. Um, in other words, trying to basically become part of the training set for these models and influence the way that they're developed and present a view of the world, which is really, I don't know, makes me deeply uncomfortable. Um, but when you think about that combined with the fact that you have multiple models competing, each model basically tells you an answer like that's the answer. It just creates a whole different ballgame in terms of manipulating truth, looking for the truth that you want. You can go to AI and say, hey, you know, O3, I'm sure, could come up with an incredible logical debate argument for almost any proposition you want to put out there. So we're heading into unknown territory. And I think the overall takeaway to my mind is the notion that public truth is going to be easily ascertainable or objective, or you're going to be able to kind of have that be in the public domain and have something be it something that people sort of feel around and debate around. I think that's going to become even harder, and you're going to have more retreating into private truths and private, domains of proprietary information that people are reluctant to share. Um, Especially as an investor, I know this is sort of slightly adjacent, but that is a huge trend that we're spending. I mean, you and I have talked about this, but um, we're spending a ton of time building out proprietary information again, because for a long time, proprietary information wasn't that useful as an investor because there was so much in the fire hose that you could get really differentiated insights by just figuring out what to focus on. Um, you know, because things would be hiding in plain sight. That's not really going to be the case for much longer, because the ability of AI and LLMs to truly grab information and digest it and identify things that previously might have gone overlooked, even though they were in public, domains, that's going to really make private data much, much more valuable in terms of a source of edge. And
Hmm.
people, firms like ours all over the world, all of the pod shops, all of these hedge funds are all investing incredible amounts into private data development and cultivation and things like that. And that sort of trend is only going to exacerbate like lack of, like, the public data is probably going to degrade in quality, and it's going to degrade in interest, because people are going to just inherently view it as less trustworthy. They're going to prefer their own proprietary databases and models that they're building. um, it's a shattering of the truth, I think, is
Yeah.
in the future.
Um, Listeners or watchers can't see this, but I have an answers price list that sat on my dad's desk for 40 plus years at Oxford College of Emory University. And it says answers 75 cents, answers requiring thought $1.25, answers correct $2.15, and dumb looks are still free. He had that on his desk for every office hours that students came into for 40 plus years, and it now sits above my desk. I look at it every day. So actually, like, there is something to that like you can give answers to anyone. In some sense, education is about the ability to inhabit different arguments, to put a coin in the slot machine and say, okay, give me the pro-China argument, give me the anti-China argument, give me the what is the argument that I'm not seeing at all, find the black swan. Like, that's the hardcore reasoning that in some sense that AI is trying to replicate. But to your point, like, yeah, and it goes to it's taken me, I mean, maybe this is banal, and it's maybe it's bad that it's taken me until August 25 to realize that the real story about AI is that the ones that are going to be able to use it the best are the ones who have the highest quality inputs and who can protect those inputs from it just being out there in the world. Because as soon as something is out there in the public domain, and this was always true theoretically, but now it's really true. Now it's lost, because now any of these AI LLMs, they can go find it, and they'll find it better than a human being can, because they're just scraping so much stuff. They're so much quicker. They're like Data in Star Trek in some sense, without a scruple. But if you have like really valuable inputs yourself, and if you're not dependent on an open AI or an Anthropic or something like that to do these things, and you can create your own internal things that allow you to protect your data, then you have a real competitive edge. The flip side of that is then you have to be extremely secure with your data. It's no longer some slap on the wrist if an employee accidentally uploads a spreadsheet with a bunch of data to something that is connected to the internet. You just lost it. Like, now it's available for anyone and everyone to sort of see. I was talking, I can't name who it was, but one client that I was working with on the consulting side recently, think of it as a logistics company for lack of a better term. And I asked, like, are you guys using AI at all? And the answer was, like, some of us are playing around with it. And in my head, I was like, you guys have access, like, you're doing logistics, so you have access to data that most people would kill for, like what people want, when they want it, how much they're buying, fuel expenses for the actual transportation. Like, you're sitting on a gold mine, and you haven't even, like, they hadn't even thought about it. They just had some employees who were like fiddling around on the side with ChatGPT and trying to explore with it. So it seems to me that we're actually like fairly early on in this trend, and that we don't understand exactly just how valuable information and quality inputs are going to be to creating these models that can then supercharge things. Because I think in some sense people are just thinking about AI and the LLMs as, oh, like, this is just the next stage of the internet, so now I'm going to be super brainy and I can sit down and Chat GPT is going to help me. Like, no, actually the way this is going to work is Amazon, not the company I was working for, so just a hypothetical example, Amazon's going to take all the data that they have, create their own LLM, and have their own model telling them what to do in terms of pricing and how to get rid of competitors and what to charge customers and how to, like, I think that's like the place that we're moving towards, and that quality of inputs and protecting inputs and then building something that your inputs can communicate to, now it's starting to come. I know I already referenced Blade Runner with the retiring Ethelbert Stewart comment. But this was another thing I said on the Substack last week. Like, suddenly the vision of a company like Tyrell Corporation becoming more powerful than governments makes sense. Because if the BLS data sucks, to go back to that, but Amazon has a proprietary data and model that allows it to have better information than the US government, who has power? Like what kind of world are we living in, and how do companies compete with that, and how does the individual consumer compete with that or get represented or protected from what your Amazons or others are going to do to you? I'm as you can tell, I'm feeling very dystopian today. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely rings true, and it harkens back to a time when corporations did have a lot more power because they had that data information. Like if you look at even the old trading houses, like this is so hard to imagine today. But back in the 60s, when you saw the first emergence of global trading houses, like previously everything was pretty local, these guys just made so much money and became so powerful because they had a freaking telex machine, like a little box, and they could communicate information, and they had the ability to arbitrage that information because they just could communicate, and they had more information than governments. Like if you look at these things, they look like a goofy little typewriter, but because they had this capability, only like the CIA had a similar level of communications ability at that time. So it really shows you how information asymmetry like that, especially relative to the public sphere or even government, like that could be very, very powerful. I don't know how that will be used, but certainly I don't think you're exaggerating to say that that shift seems to be moving back in the other direction.
Well,
Um,
and this also relates to, I read House of Morgan, I guess last year was when I finished it up finally. And I've been thinking about that book for a lot of different reasons, but also because this is what sort of started the House of Morgan, because they had relations in London that nobody else in the United States had. And so they had this intelligence network across the Atlantic Ocean that allowed them to become successful. And then they became whatever they were going to become after that. But that was the qualitative edge. It was an intelligence edge because nobody else was willing to take the risk and spend the money to establish ties across the Atlantic Ocean at a time that it was really, really hard to get information there, back and forth. To your point, too, maybe this is also a banal observation, but I had to pick something up at the post office today because I wasn't there when they delivered it at my house. And I just happened to look up while they were looking in the back for my package and thinking there must be a better way for them to organize this stuff. And I saw if you wanted to send an international letter via USPS, it was something like $45 in 6 to 10 business days. And I was like, that seems crazy to me. Like I could literally send an email like on my phone right now for no money at all, but they're going to charge $45 for me to get a piece of paper there. It's maybe we just stopped trying to optimize that cost over time. And then just the last thing, because the House of Morgan example goes back to this. I mean, it's developing into an obsession now, Rob. I think I need to start checking myself on my comparisons to the 1890s because it's getting a little out of control. But there's the House of Morgan, to your point, early versions of trading houses and global markets and their local connections and information leading them to that area. This is also something I shared on the Knowledge platform. I think it's also starting to happen in terms of impact, and philanthropy. Like there was a big article in the New York Times over the weekend about something called Robin Hood that Paul Tudor Jones stood up, and he apparently dressed up as a pirate or something at this thing and was talking like anyway, but like the who's who of all these like bajillionaires, and talking about all the different ways that the U.S. government was receding from supporting impoverished communities in different places, and how it was going to be incumbent on philanthropy and for charity to fill in the gaps there as the power of the government began to reside. And again, I'm thinking of 1890s, early 1900s, and the progressive movement and temperance, and your Carnegie's going in and saying, as a public good, we must protect these things so that the larger socioeconomic system that allowed us to become incredibly powerful remains in place. And you don't really get like an independent US government that is able to push back against that until, I mean, you could maybe say Woodrow Wilson in the context of World War I and the things he had to do to nationalize the economy to fight the war. But I think it's really, you have to get to FDR before you get US government asserting itself against, the robber barons. And if you want to, like, that's a little unfair to your Carnegies and things like that. But if, as the US government pushing back against the power of those corporations, I think it begins with FDR. It gets significantly weakened by Reagan, and maybe we're in another recession of that. I don't know. Again, I'm playing around and looking for things, but the more I think about it, the more that 1890s metaphor just gets juicier by the day.
there's a really good graphic novel I would recommend, which is called The Private Eye, which is it's a cool read, but it's on this subject of when public trust breaks down. And essentially, it's sort of a science fiction futuristic scenario where everyone's wearing disguises all the time, and the value of private information explodes. There's really no internet anymore. Everything is sort of fragmented and personal networks, and it's you know it's cool.
We've only got a few minutes left, Rob, and I told my top of the hour that I'd be 5 minutes late. So I just want to end by saying, hey, we've got a bunch of new tariffs, and probably by the time people listen to this, we'll have all sorts of other new tariffs as well. We're not going to go in depth to it. Maybe we can have a larger conversation about tariffs, although I'm honestly tired about tariffs. But I do just want to say, I don't have any clarity here, but the U.S. and India have been negotiating a trade deal for months, and the Indian side was so optimistic that they were leaking to Indian press over the last 6-7 weeks. Hey, like it's the fourth round, it's the fifth round. We're going to get it. We're going to get to 15%. Not only did they not get to 15%, Trump slapped 25% tariffs on them and railed at them about importing Russian oil, even as the West imports Russian energy and fertilizer and all these other sorts of things from Russia. But then just this morning, we're recording Wednesday, August 6th, he added another 25% because he's unhappy about India importing oil and about the way that this has gone. And what a stark turnaround this is from the first Trump administration with the Modi-Trump bromance. You might remember Trump welcoming Modi at this big stadium in Houston. Howdy, Modi. It was one of the craziest moments of the first Trump administration from my point of view. There's that. But it also, I honestly find it stupefying. I cannot explain it. I have been trying to think about it now for 48 hours, and I am just drawing blanks. Because the model, the way I'm thinking about this is, the United States and China have been the two most powerful economic nations in the world for the past 30 plus years. In many sense, it was a symbiotic relationship. The U.S. got cheap goods, China got to amass wealth and know-how, and that system is unraveling. And India is the country that should do the best. Like, they are the ones that should soak up the interest here. It's 1 billion plus people. It's really poor, which means there's a lot of room for it to grow. There's not a whole lot. Like, yes, they have some problems, but all countries have problems. Like, you would think that India is going to step up there, and you would think that the United States, like the British in the 19th century, would look at India and say, aha, like, here is a steroid shot for us. Here is a way for us to propel ourselves forward another couple of decades, even though we have high levels of debt, and even though our economy has become imbalanced because of our relationship with China over the last 30 years. Let's make good on our relations with India. They're the largest democracy in the world to boot. Like, this makes a lot of sense. And what the Trump administration has done, starting with the India-Pakistan brief war earlier this year and trying to take credit for getting the sides to stop fighting because they threatened sanctions, hosting a Pakistani official or general at the White House, releasing statements about how they're going to help develop Pakistan's mineral resources and that relations with Pakistan are so good. Pakistan nominating President Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize, and yet with India just spitting in their face over and over and over again, and this latest thing just being the latest spat. Maybe this is step 5 of Marco's negotiation tactics with India, but I have to confess to you, it's very, very rare that I get to something in geopolitics where I am flummoxed. I have no clue what the United States is doing here. It does not make any strategic sense to me. Does it make any strategic sense to you, Rob? And does it make you think at all differently about India in general if you're thinking about emerging markets and global macro?
Well, you're the geopolitical strategist, so I won't try to. If it doesn't make sense to you, it sure isn't going to make sense to me. But I guess the thing I would come back to is, the comment that you've made several times, in the recent past year, that the U.S. they're not playing the cards that they have. They're acting like they are the global hegemon, and they're not. And I think that's what stands out to me here is that they think they can bully India and get everyone basically to do what they want, and I'm not sure that that's the case from an investment standpoint, particularly with regard to India. I think it's an interesting test. Do they bend and do everything they can to try to get the U.S. sweet, or do they draw a hard line at some point and sort of reinforce the fact that they themselves are a growing independent sphere of power in this multipolar world. So that's what I'm kind of watching and waiting to see. Um, I mean, some of this stuff, the 180 on some of the tech companies in particular, like Apple, the headline came out 2 weeks ago. Apple's now sourcing
Yeah.
more from like how you can. It suggests to me that there's not a policy. Again, it's like it's not 5-dimensional chess. It's just sort of emotion and chaos in terms of what's being said and what's being decided, and
Well, yeah,
that's
and the most like reasonable explanation is that the Trump administration really wants to put pressure on Russia, and getting India to not import Russian oil is a good way to do that. But boy, are you burning long-term goodwill to do that. Like, there's an easier way to do that if you want to do it, and pissing in India's face, it seems to me, is not the right way. So let this be a call to listeners. Like, I don't understand this. If any of you understand this, please write to us. I would love to get your take. I think, by the way, it makes me optimistic about India, because I think that a country like India, in some sense, it needs hardship in order to wake up and say, we do have huge infrastructure problems. We do have huge government reforms that Modi has not been able to carry through. We do need to invest in issues like water and modernizing our agriculture system and things like that. And we can't just rely on, Modi chumming it up with Trump and Houston and putting on a cowboy hat and everything's going to be fine. Like, either we are going to rise above this, or we're not going to be able to capitalize on our potential. So maybe Indian markets vomit. I'm not sure, but for me, I'm really watching to see India's reaction, because I would think that the reaction, if Trump doesn't completely do an about face in 2 weeks, which he could, would be to really double down on Modi's self-reliance, and for India to emerge as its own pole and to invest accordingly in its own capacities. But we'll see. Like I say, like any listeners who want to give me some advice here on this, I'm listening, and we'll try to have some Indian voices on the podcast here in the next couple of weeks to get down to that. All right. I already kept us too long. Any parting words you want to say to the listeners, Rob?
Don't think so. Have a great summer.
All right. Sounds good. We'll get back to you next week, I believe. So we'll be on a weekly cadence here for a little bit.